So welcome back to our discussion on the new ISO 9001 standards for 2015. We are now going to talk a little bit about the third part of this discussion, and that is something that's near and dear to Walt and my heart, and that is risk management. There are some considerable changes to the way risk is applied to the standards, so we wanted to give you a heads up on what to expect with that.
So considering risk, one of the things that's important is it doesn't really matter what you're doing in the consideration for risk. And if one of the examples that's always used is, well, if the sink breaks, that's okay. But if I'm in a plane and the plane decides to break, it's a whole different story when we're talking about risk. And as we all know in regulated industries, safety to the patient or safety to the consumer is really paramount to life sciences when we're talking about these things. So we look at very detailed revisions to the standard to reflect how risk now is going to be used and applied in this process model. Thinking about adding and using words that we may have not been real comfortable with in the past now become pretty typical from a process orientation when we're dealing with risk determination, risk control, risk mitigation, and even the acceptability for the level of risk. And so managing it in terms of those four phases becomes a common, kind of a common orientation. And I'd like Peter, if you would, just kind of go through those phases.
Yeah, so those four phases involve risk analysis, risk evaluation, risk control, and post-product information. So under risk analysis, you've got things like intended use identifications, hazard identification, risk estimation. A lot of this is in the same language of 14971, but it's more of an enterprise approach to it, a sort of a global, company-wide, organized-wide kind of approach. Then you have risk evaluation, so that would be your risk acceptability decisions. So some of the things like acceptance criteria, making sure that you have a predefined outcome of the acceptance or what's not acceptable. The actual risk assessment, and again, just like previous standards and in the risk standards themselves, there is no mention of the actual risk assessment tool you have to use. So whether it's the matrix, the color matrix, the 3x3 matrix we see, or the DFAMICAs, or some of those other tools that are out there, doesn't describe that you have to use those. That's left to you, the organization, to figure out what's appropriate for you.
And where that emphasis is.
And it might actually be a different tool for a different situation within your organization. So you have to pick the tool that's appropriate. Risk control is also one of the phases here. So that's where you can do your option analysis, your implementation measures, residual risk evaluation. So it's not only, as we know from 14971, that you do a risk analysis one time over, that you actually have to look at it again and make sure that there aren't any residual risks out there. And then your overall risk acceptance. Then, of course, post-production information, so post-production experiments, review of risk management systems, experiences, things like customer use, and to take appropriate actions. So all of those elements are now in the new standard.
Where is risk mentioned and how does the standard deal with risk? Okay, so in several sections and even in the early planning and reference sections of the standard, the context of risk is now put into a general understanding and a much broader or robust approach to the rest of the standard. So even in section 3, we have the understanding of, what is the effect of uncertainty? What does that mean as far as a definition of uncertainty? How do we deal with that? In section 4, we look at the organization and how it takes into account acceptability and the determination of risk. And we also talk about the quality system in itself, which I think is probably a major driver for this major change, is look at the quality system relative to the determination of risk for unintended outputs or unintended use or unintended conditions as a general approach within the quality system. Of course, leadership now is ensuring and should ensure, because they need to understand risks that could affect how you meet product requirements and the customer, and that they are managed appropriately. How do you do that? You relate risk to objectives. This is going to be a totally major departure for this standard in the understanding of leadership related to objectives and planning and how risk becomes a part of that and how it's managed. And then, of course, the actions to address those risks are an important part of that in terms of resource management and, of course, again, thinking in that plan, do, check, act orientation.
Right. We also see risk mentioned in Section 6, so under planning and control changes. So identification of risk and control measures that are needed there. We also have it in Section 8 for control of external processes, so all of those supplier management areas.
Yeah.
We have it in design and development. So that's probably one of the more familiar areas where most organizations have used risk in the past in product realization or design controls. We also see it in implementation of risk control measures. And then still in Section 8, the execution and implementation section, and then the controls. Finally, we see it in risk management review. So the interesting thing here, what's the theme here that you see with risk? It's in every single section now.
It's there, it's there, it's there, it's there, it's there. It just keeps coming. So, you know, the moral of the story here is if you haven't had exposure to risk in the past, now's the time for you to become comfortable with understanding all aspects of risk as it relates to the quality management system. So, what's an organization to do and how do you understand risk now? Since risk has been documented, okay, in most of these sections, it's important to consider by starting with a risk management plan, okay, an RMP as we affectionately call it, and to look at that at a leadership level. So now you right off the bat, you're associating objectives of the quality system and associating them with risk, okay? And so the thinking now, the beginning of that thinking is how to address risk as it relates to your business so the quality system becomes a support mechanism to the success of your business.
So we've said these before, but the take-home message about all of this, these new implementations of this standard is really to stay calm. But also think about ways that your organization can start moving towards this new standard by incremental improvements now to your system in anticipation of what will be happening in 2015. Really seize the opportunities. Make sure that you, again, if you're strategizing about your overall quality management systems, make sure that you have your eye on the future and that whatever you see in this new standard, you're starting to build towards rather than staying static with the existing standards.
Yeah, I think scalability presents its own risks in terms of looking at the organization and how it's structured and understanding, again, relate objectives to risk. So your objectives have to be spelled out. They have to be, in some sense, they have to be codified like a quality manual was previous to that, okay? So it's important for us to be aware that management from a leadership perspective is driving this and that the quality unit or the people responsible for quality have a true understanding of making sure that risk becomes the lead out discussion in every element of this new standard.
Good. I agree. Well, you've seen us now talk about ISO 9001, the 215 revisions. If you have any questions about this, please contact MasterControl. We can help you wade your way through some of these new and all of these new implementations. Thanks.
Thank you, and good luck.